Thanks, everyone, for joining us back at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Christian Sorensen, who's a researcher focused on the bundling of military and big business. A U.S. military veteran, he is a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, and his research is available at thebusinessofwar.substack.com. Christian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Christian, I want to start with a map that you recently released, November of last year, which compiled public information of military contractor facilities in the United States and was also recently banned by Google, citing, quote, a potential violation of its dangerous and illegal activities policy, end quote. Now, while we wait for a response from Google as to how mapping publicly available addresses is dangerous and or illegal, could you walk us through some of the information that you compiled on this map?
Absolutely. So, first of all, my methodology was to study publicly available military contracting announcements that are posted on the Pentagon's website every day, every duty day, as well as corporate press releases and corporate job postings. And so I did that over about a 10-month span and took the disparate data and put that into a Google map. And the map shows the locations of the top 6 corporations that are quote unquote military contractors. And it basically shows what these corporations produce, where they produce it. And then I took an extra step of suggesting, based on current capacity and production, what these facilities could do tomorrow to start converting to a peace economy instead of economy based on war.
Yeah, and I want to get into that in a minute, but I also want to touch on something else that you've shared, because what you just mentioned sounds like stuff that's like the right to know, like we have a right to know. So mapping it really would just be like a public service, I feel. And you've also done some great reporting on the remarkably wide net that's cast by the military industrial complex, which includes corporations that I think most of us would not think of as military contractors, like GE, Honeywell, which does the temp controls in your homes, Comcast, Microsoft. It seems like there's just no ethical consumption under empire, to borrow the no ethical consumption under capitalism phrase. Could you talk, this net is so wide. You could probably spend the next 2 days just going through the corporations, but could you talk about how that net is cast and how we are perhaps purposefully not let into this idea that so many companies are in fact also part of the military industrial complex?
Sure. So fortunately, there are only a handful of corporations that are pure war corporations that just get maybe 96, 97, 98, 99% of their revenue from military contracting. And Lockheed Martin is a good example. It gets about 96, 97% of its money from military contracting. However, most corporations that are medium or large in size that contract with the U.S. military do not get all of their or nearly all of their revenue from military contracting. And so I see that as a good thing. That means that they're slightly ahead when it comes time to convert from a war economy to a peace economy. So what I've done over the last decade is study these military contracting announcements, distill them, and try to understand who profits from nonstop war. And what I did recently on my Substack is to compile this into one sheet that shows the repeat offenders, the corporations that are constantly coming up in contract announcements, and what do they do, what do they produce. So we know, for example, that the big 6 are, and these are the ones that I mapped as well, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, now known as RTX, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and L3 Harris. Now, they absolutely dominate military contracting. They take up maybe half of that space. The other ones do everything that the military could possibly need. So basically since the since the Vietnam War and increasingly since 9/11, more and more government military activity is handed over to corporations under what is commonly known as neoliberal economic policy. And so the military these days can't move, it can't shoot, it can't communicate, it can't do anything without corporations being fully involved. And so there are corporations that provide technology for war and the hardware and software for espionage. Those include Bose Allen Hamilton, Tacky, Leidos. These are sizable corporations. Then you have massive conglomerates. These are huge multinational corporations that also know, like these other corporations, that military contracting is incredibly lucrative. So you have a Textron, which makes golf carts, and it makes all kinds of civilian goods and sells all kinds of services to civilians. But it also makes attack helicopters. It also makes spy planes. It also makes small drones. You mentioned Honeywell. That's another one. Honeywell makes filters for your air conditioning in your home. It does thermometers, thermostats, temperature regulation inside your home. But then it also makes navigation systems. It makes helicopters, helicopter and tank engines, armored vehicles, and the like. So this can go on and on and on and on. You have massive project management firms, which I've seen in my study of contracting really dive into and really flock to the military budget over the last 10 years. And these are corporations like AECOM, which recently bought URS within the last 10 years, and just it's massive. The AECOM does things like base operations. It does a lot of logistics. Sometimes it oversees military stock that is pre-positioned overseas. So AECOM, Bechtel, Jacobs, Fluor, KBR should be a name that is familiar to people because it was involved in some notorious alleged profiteering during the early invasion and occupation of Iraq. So you have all these different things all these different categories of big business that keep the Pentagon and the military operations around the globe up and running, and they profit while that goes on. So other categories include accounting firms that audit the military. They get in on it. Consulting firms get in on it. IT corporations that we know, like Amazon, HP, IBM, Intel, Microsoft, they provide the military computing backbone. Your telecoms also provide communications infrastructure and research and development. You have private equity firms increasingly buying up medium-sized war corporations, blending them, and then trying to sell them for a profit later on. So it really goes on and on. The big takeaway is that corporations, large and small, know that the business of war is incredibly lucrative and that it is not really regulated. And there are corporations like TransDigm, which is alleged in very good reporting, mainstream reporting even, to price gouge the Pentagon. So there's incredible room for profit, and this is a direct transfer of the working class taxpayers' taxes to the Pentagon and then to big business, and big business knows where the money is. So
yeah, absolutely. And as you say, you could go on, and I definitely recommend that folks check out your Substack, because you have that one page that is a deep dive. Even though it's just that one page, it's a really powerful and disgusting read. And again, like, people should not be that surprised, though. I think that people have this feeling that, oh, it's different, it's changed, like the fact that IBM worked with Germany during the Second World War to do the computing system inside concentration camps, or that's where Fanta came from, so that Coca-Cola could keep going with the market in Europe during the war.
bingo.
I just feel like people have, well, that's disgusting things that happened back then, but it just seems like the PR has gotten better. Honeywell's commercials are not obviously showing the despicable war machine that they're profiting from. And I feel like it's even more insidious than that, because what I didn't really realize, which you also shared on that one sheet, is how this intersects with colonialism here at home. And you point out that many tribes are also military contractors. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So there was an act in the 1970s called the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement Act, excuse me. And what it basically did was it said, all right, the U.S. federal government said, all right, you Alaskan Native tribes can no longer have outstanding claims and grievances regarding, the genocide, basically, of the natives that the U.S. government and, in large part, the U.S. military took part in during the establishment and the expansion of the colonies. And so what the text of the act said is, all right, if you drop these claims, then in turn, we will provide you with several, perks and incentives. And a big one was preferable bidding in government contracting. And as we know, government contracting is largely military contracting. And so what basically happened since the 70s, over the last several decades, is that these corporations, the corporations that represent the Alaskan Native tribes, have turned into very adept military contractors. And they do everything from, small and medium-sized information technology to they pop up all over the place. They really do everything. They do logistics sometimes. They create small gear and sometimes even light weaponry. It's really astonishing, and it speaks to the power of the federal government and the power of military contracting. And if we don't all unite as the proverbial 99% and push back against this, then the U.S. ruling class will get its way in the near term and in the long term. And so I don't really know where to go from there, because the money that is available through military contracting is so it's so ready, it's so there, and these tribes are in so deep. And it's actually important to state that the act was signed by the tribal leadership. It was not ratified in a broadly democratic manner by everyone in the tribes. So it's important not to blame, the tribes themselves. It's just, it can be seen, or it could be seen as an example of capitalist leadership coercing or effectively co-opting leaders, not unlike what they do with union leaders over time. I think there's an analogy there if anybody wants to dive into that. So it's not exclusive to the Alaskan tribes. You have Hawaiian Native corporations as well, and you have some corporations like Cherokee in the contiguous 48 states that do the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, again, a disgusting confluence of colonialism and imperialism.
Bingo.
And I wanted to ask you kind of, because we've been talking about the budget and you were talking about price gouging, and I'm curious, like, what's pushing what here? Because it seemed like you mentioned this is ready money, and every single year the United States government puts more and more money into that budget. And as George Carlin said, the U.S. is basically just an oil corporation with an army. Is it the corporate world that pushes via price gouging or things like that for there to always be more money? Or is it, like, as you also mentioned, the Pentagon has failed every audit. It doesn't know what it has, but it keeps buying things. And because there's just this war hawkish culture in the U.S., is it the government that's pushing, or is it, kind of a combination of the two?
I would point to the classic definition of fascism, which is what we saw in the 20s and, in the 30s and 40s in Italy under Mussolini, and what we saw in the 30s and 40s in Germany under Hitler. And that classic definition is the bundling of government authority and big business. And that is exactly what the military-industrial complex is. Now, it is very uncomfortable for us in a country where we are taught that not only are we a democracy, but we are the example of a democracy, to then confront the fact that maybe we're not even a democracy, maybe we are one of the worst political economic systems one can imagine, and that is fascism. So I argue that the military-industrial complex is classic fascism. It is the bundling of government authority and big business, and it is that bundle, not government, not big business, but that bundling. And we see it in many ways, calling the shots. And so there's no distinction between the two sides. And so sometimes you see, oh, hey, it's big business capturing government through campaign finance or through dark money, donating to both of the capitalist political factions, the red team and the blue team, or through lobbying. But those are more like examples of the bundling in action. It is important that we just take a step back and be honest with what we have here in the United States and go from there, because we can't fix the system unless we understand how it operates.
Absolutely. And so I want to circle back to something that you mentioned before, which is your suggestions on how to shift this economy. And I feel like I really enjoy talking about like intersections of issues, particularly as an organizer. It seems like there's a powerful connection between anti-war movement and the labor movement here. And because these corporations that you're talking about, they're well known for, I mean, Amazon, Jesus, exploiting workers.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciated about your Substack, Business of War, you suggest these pivots, what you call economic conversion. Could you walk us through some of those ideas with regards to that?
Sure. So first, let me define economic conversion. Economic conversion simply involves changing the output of existing industrial capacity. So if you are, for example, a Lockheed Martin plant in Marietta, Georgia, making a cargo plane, and that cargo plane is used right now for military, then changing that in that output is that cargo plane is now used for search and rescue or firefighting or humanitarian relief or anything like that. So that's a simple example. That's a straightforward example. Now, it's important to note that industry adjusts all the time. It adjusts all the time. Industry, big business is top down. It is corporate executives making the calls, making the shots. The workers, the 99%, do not have any say in this. It is not a democratic institution. Nonetheless, industry adjusts all the time, but it just happens to, under this current system, adjust in order to get more profit. So executives in the war industry regularly order, for example, new facilities to be built. We saw this recently with the fad of hypersonic missiles. Industry did a really good job through its think tanks and through its politicians on the take of hyping up hypersonic missile capabilities of some of the official bad guys like Russia and China, in order to then posture as our production of hypersonic missiles and technology as defensive. And this is a classic move where you inflate a threat overseas to then build up your own war profiteering here at home. So Lockheed Martin, for example, opened a new facility in northern Alabama. It broke ground in 2019. It opened in 2021 to manufacture hypersonic weapons. Northrop Grumman did the same thing in Maryland for hypersonic propulsion systems. Broke ground 4 years ago, opened up last year in 2023. So industry is constantly adjusting. So economic conversion is not something that industry can't do. It adjusts all the time. It's just adjusting for its own narrow war profiteering motives. Now, there are numerous benefits to economic conversion. Wait, let me back up for a second. The map that I put out that Google then censored included suggestions based on current manufacturing capabilities for each facility to immediately pivot to a producing stuff for peace or civilian use, not for war or espionage. And so every single facility that I mapped belonging to the top 6 military contractors can indeed tomorrow, if there were the political will, start at least trying to produce for beneficial civilian fields. And so to say that it can't be done is absolute nonsense. It absolutely can be done. The facilities already exist, and the workers in the facilities are brilliant and they're industrious. They are hardworking. They absolutely can produce beneficial, peaceful things for civilian use. And so we know that every single facility in the largest war corporations can do this. And we know that the workers, like the engineers, the physicists, the welders, the truck drivers, the electricians, can also do this. So all that's lacking is the political will, and we can get to that later. And the workers would benefit incredibly. Right now, the workers in the war industry produce products that are used in war and espionage. And the ruling class, the 1%, the executives, the financial tycoons, Wall Street barons, they take the profit that the workers create. The workers are given a wage, disguising the fact that the workers produce way more money every single day, and that money is profit, and that the ruling class takes that profit. The ruling class uses that profit for stock buybacks, dividend payments to shareholders, for political aims like dark money. They have all sorts of things, none of which help the workers, by the way. Massive compensation for corporate executives is another example of where the profit goes. So once the workplace is democratized, then the workers, not the executives, will be in charge. And the workers will keep the profit that they make, and the workers will then, under economic conversion, be producing good stuff that actually helps us. And then there are even more benefits: less death, less destruction, less pollution. Every single major military contractor, at least in the top 6, has been accused, even by the EPA and by the federal government, which doesn't really regulate industry. So you can imagine how bad the situation really is if our government actually regulated industry, have been accused of polluting. There's the Orlando Sentinel did a piece on Lockheed Martin pollution, Orlando. Local papers in Los Angeles have done pieces on Raytheon pollution out there. And even some corporate websites and corporate 10K reports to the SEC, which are released every year, acknowledge pollution. So there'd be less pollution because the workers would not, first of all, not be producing products that pollute through the manufacturing process, and they wouldn't pollute their hometown anyway. Why would you pollute your own soil, your own air, your own drinking water? So that's another benefit. There's also economic conversion also frees up all of this roughly $1 trillion that we spend every year on war and espionage to then be used for the benefit of the American public, because you're no longer deploying the troops all around the world for corporate profit and to bully countries and to invade and occupy countries and to open up countries for multinational corporate plunder. You are actually democratizing in the process. You're establishing democracy in the United States, and you're democratizing foreign policy. So there's political space to bring the troops home and take care of them. There is enormous $1 trillion that, instead of being spent on war and espionage every year, is actually spent on the American public, which is in dire need of debt relief, affordable education, affordable housing, infrastructure, transportation, healthcare. I mean, we are hurting as a people, and it is a lot. And we are hurting as a people because of corporate greed. We are hurting as a people because of the permanent warfare state. So yeah, money that once was tied up in this massive war and espionage budget is now freed for public need. So the benefits are enormous, and it's really encouraging that programs like Project Censored and others in the independent media are talking about it, because it's really the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to get your take on this political will aspect, because I don't like the silver bullet questions like, oh, what do we do? But I
Right.
am curious, particularly with your background, um, how do you feel is because this government never does anything good because it just woke up one day and was like, wow, this is the right thing to do. Everything that has happened that we would look at as positive in the history of this country has been done because people fought and oftentimes died in order to push that and make it politically untenable to do anything else. So with regards to this, I mean, it seems like workers would have a lot of power with this in terms of, democratizing the workplace and then making that shift. But I'm also curious about veterans, because it seems like there's a lot of power in these spaces where there are veterans, as you pointed out, coming home, not getting the care that they require. We've had Matthew Ho on the show several times talking about this moral injury, extreme PTSD and things like that, and that there's a lot of solidarity there as well in terms of having that shift come from the inside as well. Could you talk a little bit about how you see that, perhaps some potentials in terms of organizing in these spaces?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. There is a growing working class consciousness in this country, and a growing understanding of how the system works. People are beginning to, thanks to organizers, thanks to people who have sacrificed their entire lives to get this information out there, are people from throughout the history of this country, the dissidents, the rebels who have taken time to educate us all, and on whose shoulders we stand here today. People are, we're really starting to understand that the United States is a class society. The working class is everyone who puts in a day's labor for a wage. Your truck driver, your nurse, your electrician, your farm worker, etc. Then there's the ruling class, the proverbial 1%. These are the Wall Street barons, the financial tycoons, the top corporate executives, the politicians on the armed services committees and the foreign affairs committee and the foreign relations committee and the intel committees, who legislatively facilitate permanent warfare, nonstop war. And so the ruling class, we come to understand, uses its tools, including the armed forces, including economic sanctions, and intelligence agencies, to bully and harm governments that do not follow the edicts that Washington, D.C. issues. And D.C. is concerned solely with protecting and promoting capitalism around the globe. That is its core goal. And so we also come to know that the U.S. ruling class profits from war as it implements this belligerent foreign policy. And it is incredibly profitable, as we know. There's nothing defensive about the military-industrial complex. And this is what we sort of intuitively understand and have a hard time confronting as soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, guardians now. As the pawns of empire, we are bombarded with propaganda. We are really indoctrinated. And people react different ways to it. Some people really double down on it. Some people really consume it. And I get that. I absolutely get that. Some people are appalled by it. Some people react. Some people, in any event, it's getting harder and harder with our ability to share information is getting harder and harder for the U.S. ruling class to keep the lid on our growing understanding of how the system works. And that is why censorship is so important these days. Both parties are committed to it. If you think or operate outside the anti-worker system known as capitalism, then you will get censored if you are deemed to be a threat to the system. So big kudos to Project Censored for keeping on.
Well, kudos right back. And right before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you about this, because this is something else that you cover in your Substack. And as a word nerd myself, I found it really interesting that you highlighted these things. For instance, I'll just give two examples. that you say it's not the border industrial complex and it's not the surveillance industrial complex. Could you talk a little bit about why you make those distinctions?
I just highlight that because you hear it's almost vogue to say that the new thing is a blank industrial complex. And I say that it is not the border industrial complex. It is the military industrial complex doing the border. It is not the surveillance industrial complex. It is the military industrial complex doing surveillance, because that's exactly what it is. These are the same corporations. These are the same big businesses. These are the same Wall Street conglomerates, massive institutional stockholders, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, that are behind the whole thing. It is the same business of war, wherever it's directed. If it's directed overseas, it's the same business of war. If it's directed inside against the American public, it's the same business of war. The same corporations that help NSA, for example, reportedly spy on countries around the world, corporations that you see in military contracting announcements like CACI, SAIC, Leidos, Bose Allen Hamilton. These are also the same corporations that keep appearing in the, for example, the Snowden leaks that regarding the surveillance of the American public here. So it's not the surveillance industrial complex. It's just the military industrial complex doing surveillance against the American public. Same thing on the border. You see Amazon. You see Northrop Grumman establishing databases for documenting who comes with facial recognition and massive databases. You see General Dynamics towers. You see all of the same corporations. They're just finding new ways to profit off of state of permanent warfare. So it's important to clarify that, and I'm really glad you brought it up.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that you say that, because I think it also makes the important point that the military industrial complex is not something that's just pointed outward. That I like to say imperialism is a home game, and there's no way that you can speak the language of violence outside of our borders and then be like, Mr. Rogers here at home.
Yep.
So Christian, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. Again, if folks would like to check out your work, which I absolutely recommend that you do, his research is available at thebusinessofwar.substack.com. Christian, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.